Suicide is something that many of us have been affected by, either in our immediate family or friends and neighbors that we know. And it can be devastating to us. And it can create a sense of loss and the difficulty of getting through that. And I'm really pleased to be able to have someone on the show today that has gone through that and has experienced that chaos and that grief of having a loved one commit suicide. And I hope that you'll enjoy the show today. It's going to be something that I think will make a difference for you if you happen to have ever experienced that, as far as how do we work through that and how do we help others to work through that.
At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Hey folks, Dr. Doug here with Dr. Doug and Friends Radio. Thank you for joining us. Tom Fargnoli. And I know I mispronounced that last name already, and here I had been practicing on it. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Doug. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, and it's interesting. In today's environment right now, we're seeing a lot of chaos going on. We're seeing a lot of pain that people are experiencing. You have an amazing story, and you have an amazing background. I mean, you were a systems engineer?
Yes, correct.
Magician?
Yeah.
Teacher, an ex-deacon in the Catholic Church,
Yes.
and now an author. And I think that's true of so many of us that have gone from one thing to another. I keep telling people it's kind of a personality disorder of multiple personalities. But anyway, you've done a lot of things, but you have an incredible story, obviously, and that's the reason I wanted to have you on the show today. Would you share with the audience a little bit of your background, who you are, and then your story?
Sure. Well, I had the perfect life. And I still have a perfect life, really. But in many ways, I married my high school sweetheart. We were married for 40 years. Lived in the same house for 40 years. I worked in the same company, which is really strange today, for 40 years. Started out as a software engineer and moved to a systems engineer. Magic has been part of my life. I started doing magic when someone made a lit cigarette disappear in front of my eyes, and I had to find out how to do it. And so I've used magic in all of those pieces of my life. I've used it in system engineering when I was teaching for Lockheed Martin. I've used it in the community college when I was an adjunct, and I used it in my ministry as a deacon to bring scripture to life in some ways. So the magic's been very good in bringing an emotional content to the context of the material, which could be boring. So I've done all of that. And as I say, it really was a perfect life. And then, of course, the unexpected happened, as it does for so many of us. In my case, it's the unexpected started with the tragic loss of my wife, who took her own life. We didn't see this coming, despite her brothers doing the same thing. Can you imagine 3 siblings in one family?
Wow! Oh my goodness!
But everything changed at that point. Grieving is fairly, everyone grieves when you lose someone close to you. But when you lose someone to suicide, unfortunately, the grieving becomes much more complicated, much more intense. Just because of the word suicide, if you mention that S word to someone, it basically shuts down the conversation. People just don't know how to react, and they don't mean to be disrespectful, but they really just shut down. So you feel shunned in a lot of ways.
Well, and it is interesting. I've experienced with my extended family a couple of my nephews that committed suicide, and particularly as I talked to one brother, um, very difficult and very difficult to have people obviously not know how to speak to him or say things that were so ridiculous to say, and that can be so tough, and particularly in that area. I mean, I think a death of a loved one, depending on when it happens, can be devastating in and of itself. But to have that happen because of suicide can be so tremendous. And quite frankly, from what I can read of the statistics, because of the COVID and what's been going on, we're starting to see even an increase in suicide. So I suspect there are a lot of people out there, many who may be listening to the show, that have experienced that or will experience that.
Yes, and you're right. Unfortunately, those statistics are really increasing across all age levels. I remember at one point studying in college that the highest age group of suicide was 18 to 22, but now it's throughout all the demographics are showing that suicide is increasing. When I was a deacon, I used to do a lot of services at the funeral home, and every time, I, I I I come across so many suicides, uh, and again, all ages. It was very alarming, and I'm sure it's getting more and more as time goes on.
Well, and unfortunately, depending on one's faith, depending on what their religious beliefs happen to be, it can be extremely devastating because oftentimes people lose hope. Now, that doesn't happen to be my belief. I believe that there's a great deal of hope, but for some, I know that it can create that type of issue. What did you find were the emotions that came up for you when you experienced the fact that your wife had committed suicide? Because I imagine there are some emotions that are very common to most people who are close to someone where that occurs.
Right. Well, first and foremost, I think the word suicide, there's so many types of suicide. I think the layperson, when they hear someone committed suicide, what they think about is, oh, well, this person made a decision. This person decided to, she couldn't handle it, or he couldn't handle the stress, or they lost hope. But what I have found is there's so many different types of suicide. And the majority of them, most times, the person who does that is in tremendous pain, tremendous emotional pain. And it's not that they want to die, it's just that they have to get out of this emotional pain. Uh, and they don't see a way out. And it's not a rational decision by no means. Uh, in some cases, I'm sure it can be, but in many cases, it's not a rational decision. And it's unfortunate because if you look back, and when someone takes their own life, the family and friends immediately think, "Man, I wish I knew that person was thinking like that. I could have talked to them. I wish I did make that phone call. I wish I did visit them. I wish I did say something." And that's a tremendous amount of afterthought when that happens. So there's a extreme amount of guilt too for a lot of the suicide survivors, which is an interesting word, right? When you say suicide survivor, it's really, I used to think, well, someone attempted suicide and survived it, but no, the suicide survivors are the ones that are left behind. And so often, as I mentioned my situation, I wish people would want to talk about my wife, and not just so much of the event that took place, but the person that commits suicide is much more than the event. They had a full life. In my wife's case, she started showing signs of depression only 3 months before the act. Up until that point, No one saw that coming at all. So my advice is that if you to try to talk to people as much as possible. Don't get to the point where you're saying I wish I had talked and I was embarrassed to say anything.
Yeah, I think, as you say, there's a lot of guilt that can come about because of that, which really shouldn't be there. You bring up an interesting point that I think is really important, and that is that people, in most cases, who commit suicide are in an emotional state where suddenly they're not being totally rational the way we would consider being rational. I know that my one nephew that committed suicide had some depression and so on and so forth, was on specific medication, committed suicide. 2 months later, the company that produced that medication came out and said, oh, by the way, one of the side effects of this medication can potentially be suicide. And so, I think often it's just like with Johnson and Johnson that just came out and talked about the fact that their vaccination for the COVID, in 1 in a million cases so far, causes some blood clotting. And everyone's getting all nervous about that. And one of my daughter-in-laws is saying, the bottom line is that birth control pills has a higher number of blood clotting side effects than that particular vaccination does.
My wife and I had the same conversation last night, and that's so true. Yeah, birth control, much more blood clots. Yeah.
And so the point being, unfortunately, is that when medications are prescribed, when things like this go on, we don't have the point yet where you can go in and literally look at the genes and the DNA and discover which people that might be on a particular medication are going to have some type of reaction, particularly when it comes to an emotional situation where it potentially could be suicide. And I don't know what the numbers are for those that are on an antidepressive before they commit suicide. But I think that's one factor. And I think then, as you say, the other factor is just when they get to a point where emotionally they don't feel like there's any hope in their lives.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on the medical factors, but I'm sure it's not just depression medicine, but there almost any new drug that comes out, at the end they start listing the side effects, and you hear, suicide is a potential side effect of medicine for your skin, and so many different types of medicine. And why is that?
Well, and how do you overcome? I mean, with your background in Catholicism, and I'm not a Catholic, so I don't really understand your full beliefs in that. But for those that have a really serious belief about suicide in the hereafter, how does one overcome that? What type of coping mechanisms? Not only that, but other types of societal things that suddenly come upon us, the judgment and all of that. How does one develop some, I guess, coping mechanisms to help them get through that? And how long does it take?
Yeah, well, how long does it take? Well, that's a tough one because, you talk about the different stages of grief and they all enter into this, but suicide really does intensify those levels of grief. You talk about the denial stage, you talk about a anger stage, you talk about, various different stages until finally you accept something. With suicide, again, those stages are much more intense, and they're not necessarily linear in the sense of, I've completed this stage, I'm now into the anger stage. That anger stage could come back, and acceptance is not the final stage in some cases. Sometimes you accept the death, but you don't accept the ramifications of the death. In other words, you don't accept how your life has changed because of this person. You accept the death, but you don't accept the changes that you go through. So all of those things With respect to the Catholic religion and most religions, I would think there's misconceptions, and and I know with the Catholic religion, they stopped teaching people 50 years ago, and so what people know now is what they learned when they were children,
Right.
and unfortunately, they're not, really in the education business the way they should be, but if you go to a priest that's fairly knowledgeable and you ask them about suicide, or if you just look it up, you'll see that the person's not going to hell. The person's not condemned. The person we don't know the extent of God's love. We just know it's pretty strong, and we know that His mercy is more stronger than any wrath that He may have. And we don't know what that person's life is like. I feel in my wife's case, who was very close to God in many ways. I would say she was more spiritual than religious in some ways, but she was a good person. And people will tell you that that's got to be the main thing you have to key on is the goodness of someone. Doesn't matter if they go to this church or that church or they go in any church at all. I have a sister that doesn't go to any churches, but she
Right.
every year at Christmas she buys 50 coats and gives them out to the poor. So there's actions I think speak louder than words, and whether you're hooked up with one. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions. Back to your original question, and again, I think it's the love that it allows you to cope, and understanding how much God loves us, and that's pretty much what got me through.
Well, and I think you have a really good point about the misconception, because, how often can we literally go in and help someone who's going through this understand that whatever they heard that actually, as you say, came from 50 years ago, with where there was greater misconception, and understanding now a greater reason for things happening, where you can really touch their lives and lift their spirit by helping them to understand that it's an entirely different situation here than what we used to think.
Yeah. Yeah, there's still unfortunately a lot of rules and regulations involved with religion that get in the way sometimes. I always think back, when Jesus was here, he was kind of against the Pharisees with all. He said, they're too much concerned with the letter of the law and not the heart of the law. And so here I am. I decided to be a deacon. This is many years of the decision, and my wife and I talked about it. And so I go into the diaconate, which is a 6-year program of study. While I was still an engineer, it was before I retired. And the first thing they said to us was, you have to realize that if your wife dies, you can't have another relationship. You'll have to be celibate, and you certainly can't have a relation. Certainly can't get married again as a deacon. Well, okay. Well, and my wife was upset more than me. I said, why are you upset? I'm probably going to live longer I'm going to die before you. And she said, well, I just don't want you to be alone. So I knew about this rule going in. I knew about it up here, but I had no concept of what I would go through. So not only was my grieving complicated because it was suicide, right from the beginning, I was faced with, not that I wanted to run out and get married, but I was faced with this door is shut now. All I ever knew was a relationship. 40 some years. I knew her since high school. And so now, priests take this commitment from a young age, the majority of them, but deacons, 99% of deacons in the Catholic Church are married.
Mhm.
Now here I am, lost my wife, and faced with this. So that even added another degree of complexity to my grieving process. Couldn't make that decision. It took me 2 years to make that decision.
And what did you decide to do?
Well, one day it seemed like, what? I signed up for this, and I love being a deacon. I love going to the hospitals. I would take magic to the hospitals and do magic tricks for the patients, when appropriate. I love doing the funerals. I mean, I know that sounds really crazy, right? But I did love the challenge of trying to bring the faith to people. Uh, and I loved every aspect of Deacon. So faced with turning away, but then I never experienced the loneliness. You know, it wasn't too long after my wife passed away that I remember one morning I woke up with a little pain in my chest. It was more like a heartburn. So I drove myself to the hospital. They admitted me, or not admitted me, but they checked me out. They said, "Well, we want to do a catheterization." So they did this catheterization. After it was over, they said, "We have good news and bad news. Good news is your heart's pretty strong, but you're 98% blocked." And I needed quadruple bypass.
Wow.
So now I'm in the hospital. My wife is already gone, you know. So this is when I started to really experience loneliness. And the decision was kind of made at that point. I decided that no, I do want to pursue another relationship down the road. And so I made my decision. And then making that decision, it was almost like I was grieving again. And what made it even worse was that the rejection.
Yes.
The church really treated me as if I left church, which I never did. My faith is still strong. I just left being a deacon. But a lot of priests, even some fellow deacons, could never really understand that decision, and I felt shunned again. And you know, luckily, when I made that decision, not too far after, you know, I met Dorothy, and so you know, here we are now. And she lost her husband rather suddenly and tragically, and also married 44 years. So we kind of helped each other through it, and you know, I believe we both believe that God kind of brought us together, but we also believe that our spouses brought us together in some strange way.
Well, and you know, you bring up an interesting dilemma, and that is when when one's past beliefs and you know really deep embedded beliefs that are important and true to them suddenly no longer serve us well. And all of a sudden, we're having to make choices that, as you say, you make a choice because it's not serving you well. And the minute you've made that choice, then suddenly all of that guilt and that rejection and judgment and all of that comes in again, not only from the outside, but even internally. I think that happens. How do you help people to be able to get past those situations where those beliefs no longer serve them well?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I think I would resort to one of my favorite authors, Blaise Pascal, who back in the day in the 1600s, he was always noted for his calculus, uh, and you know, but he also wrote a book, Thoughts, or in French, Pensées, and he said that when you're given a choice, and well, first of all, easy choices to make are easy, right? But it's those tough choices. He says, pick the path with the heart. In other words, examine what's in your heart and pick the right path that way. Now, see, my problem was both paths had a heart. I had being a deacon was a good thing, but then you know, I wasn't being true to myself because I really was made to have a relationship. I was made to share love with someone, and so that one won out. And also in talking to my psychologist, that, you know, all these things that we're going through, I was meeting with my therapist. In fact, he told me to write things down, and that's how this book started. But he said that, you know, if you look back at a decision and you keep saying, boy, did I make the right one? Because you know the grass is always greener, and you think, what if I did this? What if I did that? He says, you know what? You may have made the wrong decision, but you made the decision based on what was at your fingertips. You weighed all the pros and cons. You examined your heart. You made the right decision. Now you go forward with it. That's how I would probably placate anyone who really struggled over which path to walk down. And of course, prayer. I prayed a lot. I yelled at God constantly, screamed at him actually. And did I make the right decision? Sometimes I look back and I go to church now, I go to mass, I look at a deacon, I'll look at, and I'm saying, geez, if I was up there, I would do things a little differently. I would say this, I wouldn't have said that. So I'm my own worst enemy, but I'm happily married. It worked out good for me. So when he told me to write all this down, I started writing it down. And then I said, well, you know what? COVID-19 hit. I said, let me put this in a book. I started praying about that. And a crazy idea came to me of how to organize this. It's my true story, but I put a touch of fiction in to make it interesting for the reader. And my wife said, you know what? She started reviewing chapter by chapter. She says, you're really going to help a lot of people with this. I says, well, you think? She says, oh my goodness, so many people have dealt with grieving, dealt with suicide, dealt with rejection. They're going to see how you held your faith through all of this, and they're going to be helped. So it kind of motivated me. I put it together in a kind of, the touch of fiction that I added was that I'm being interviewed by a reporter.
Mm-hmm.
And he turns out to be somebody special. And that comes out at the end. I'm not going to give that away. But right. I made it very, so when a reader reads it, and the letters verified this, I started getting a lot of letters, that the readers actually do feel like they're walking with me. And they can also relate to their unexpected events as well.
Well, and it's interesting. I got into a conversation with a group of people. We were all together on a webinar type of thing, and we were talking about this very thing. And there were a number of very deeply religious people who had shared the fact that for them also, there was a point in time where certain parts of that belief system that they had grown up within no longer was serving them well. And I brought up the fact that, so often when that occurs, we abandon everything. Because if this doesn't work for us, then we have to abandon the whole thing. And one of the ladies brought up a very interesting metaphor. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the word Jenga or the game Jenga. I guess it's a bunch of building blocks, and you build a building and then you start
the wrong one and they all fall down.
Right. And she brought up the point, which I thought was fascinating, that you can actually build that building and pull out the corner and it doesn't collapse. And you might even pull out a couple of blocks and it doesn't collapse. And her point in the metaphor of that was, you can find that there are certain areas that really do not serve you well anymore, but everything else is still there. So as you mentioned, you quit being a deacon and you were obviously judged and to some degree probably persecuted for that. And yet your comment was, but I'm still very involved and very faithful and all of that. And that's the point. You don't have to abandon everything. All you have to do is pull out some of those little corners that are not serving you well anymore, evaluate those. And meanwhile, that building is still there and that foundation is still there for you. And I think that's important for people to understand.
Yeah, that's a beautiful analogy. I like that. I'll use that one.
Okay. So
I'll have to come up with a magic trick now for that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me know when you do. So your book, what's the name of your book?
Okay, the book is called The Deacon, An Unexpected Life. And again, it's my story. It's as I put it together. And my goal was to take the readers through it. They'll go through, they'll be with me in the hospital as I go through administering to patients. They'll be with me when I was called to the operating room. The emergency room one day when there was a crisis. They'll be with me when I went through the diaconate, the formation. What's it like to be a deacon? What's it involve? So I take them along with me. Some of the decisions that I made. They'll be with me through the horror that I went through. They'll see what it was like to have not only my wife commit suicide, but my two brother-in-laws as well, and how that occurred. And they'll be with me through that battle of making this decision. They'll be with me when I made my decision, and they'll be with me through the peace that I found through it all. So, my wife gave me a gift, master's class on writing, and I took this course, Naaman. Anyway, he wrote. He's teaching this course of how can you make a story moving, whether if it's a fiction book or novel or even if it's a real true story in my case. So I put this together, but it really came together well, and all proceeds go to suicide awareness. I don't make a dime on this book, but it really came together, and now it has me thinking about another book down the road.
Well, and that's great. I imagine that you've touched some lives with this book. And, I remember once when I was teaching a Sunday school class, and a couple of weeks later, someone came up to me and said, I can't tell you what a difference that made for me. And I thought to myself, that's the first time ever. And in some respects, it's probably been the last time ever. And so often we don't really ever experience the effects, the positive effects or the negative effects, but the positive effects that we can have on people just by those things that we've done. Have you gotten some letters and some feedback and some stories that you could share with the audience of people
Sure.
who have read your book and it's made a difference for them?
Sure. And just to, the context of that boy who came up to you, and however, when he did it then or later in life, Confucius said that it's better to save one life than to build a 7-story pagoda. And, if you have an effect upon that boy, that makes it all worth it. Yes, the letters started coming in. The close letters, the people that knew me, obviously they're going to be warm letters. But then I started getting letters from people that didn't know me. One in particular said he found out he had liver cancer, and he just had finished reading the book. And he said, I made the relationship I had with this person who's interviewing me, made him have a closer relationship with God, and that was kind of my intent. And so it, obviously, he has to deal with the liver cancer, but he felt like he wasn't alone in dealing with that bad news. And that's when I really decided to go forward with the book and to, bring it outside the warm market into the cold market. And I think, it's been working out pretty well. So a lot of the other letters, again, just more or less, I enjoyed your story. Wow, that was crazy ending, and that kind of a thing. But I just feel like, now putting together that book was a lot easier because it happened to me. The next one, which is going to be mostly fiction, but with a purpose, is going to be a little more challenging. But the letters have made it with it. And being a retired engineer now and magician, I still do magic. In fact, on my website, people can go to the end and they'll see I do a bunch of magic tricks on the website, and I try to build a story with them. So if I'm talking to someone about the love that we talked about, the love of God, I will bring 2 magic balls into the picture, and I will take one. And can't really see it too good, but I'll take one, put it in my hand, and make it dash. And then I bring it, of course, back in 2 balls to say that, Jesus really never leaves us, and you're never alone. So just little things like that. But the letters have made it really helpful for me, and I'm full steam ahead.
Well, and I think I think you bring up so many good, important points of the fact that grieving, based on whatever experience we've had, can be so difficult. And as you said, they've come up with all these steps. Somebody that was very analytical came up with all of these steps of grief. And it's like, you know what? That may not necessarily apply to us all. But what's the real point of experiencing grief, in your opinion, and how does someone work through it?
I think you just said it. You have to work through it. I don't think you can go around it. I think that would be my experience, and that in the beginning, I guess there was a certain amount of denial, to use the steps, but I just my when this happened, it happened in the middle of December. I said to myself, January, I'm going back to being a deacon, and I'm basically, I just lived as if nothing happened. But that kind of backed up on me, and I just find times, when I come home and was lonely, very, very alone. Even had a hard time putting away the Christmas decorations that my wife had actually decorated. But I think you have to give yourself time. Don't make any major decisions the first year, because you just change all the time. There's so many agencies out there that can help. There's grieving classes, there's grieving groups, some religious, some non-religious. It doesn't really matter, but try to be with people who can have experience with you experience. That helped me a lot. And everyone's situation is a little different, of course, but to hear someone else talk about how they, improved over, they couldn't play the radio for a long time after their spouse died, because the songs were too painful. And after like the second year, they started to listen to the songs again with just a little different thought, like, oh, yeah, I remember my wife loved that song. Flower Girl was one of mine. She always loved flowers. So now I can listen to that song. But I think, you have to go through all of it. And everyone's different. Sometimes I think people can go through that whole process in months. Other people takes 5-6 years. Other people never get through it. But you can't go around it. You have to go through it.
How much does a sense of gratitude play into this?
Well, I can look, when it comes to the actual event, not so much.
Right.
But when I think about the heart problem, I thought it was heartburn. I just thank God that I had enough sense to drive to the hospital, because I was in Norway 2 weeks before this, and just because I wanted to get away, and I was hiking around through these mountains. I could have had this heart attack or whatever, and that would have been the end of it. So I thank God that I had enough sense to go to the hospital. And I'm appreciative for almost everything anymore. I'm appreciative for everything. My stomach's working correctly. I thank God for that. But yeah, I think that's a major. Oh, I think I lost you.
Well, let's talk about the projects that you have coming up. You've got you're going to write another book.
Yes.
You're working on working on the suicide prevention. What are some of the projects that this has led you to, which are going to be very positive in touching other lives?
Yes. Well, the project that I'm on now is going to be a story of a man who is trying to find purpose in his life, to find meaning, find truth. That sounds like a cliche, but he's a person like that most people can relate to. Maybe a little bit of COVID situation in there, and some of the politics that are going on. He's looking for some truth. He's looking for some, something to make life more meaningful. And he finds, he finds someone. He actually finds someone who he has discussions with, and this person gives him a whole different way of looking at God. Never before. It's a completely different way. As if, you would look at a stream of water and say, wow, that stream's always there. I just have to dip my ladle into it. And I have this love or this peace, all of the things that he's looking for. And so that's kind of the project that I have. And so I'm hoping that when someone reads this, it'll touch them in a way that, oh, maybe I should look at God a little different.
Yeah, that's great. And then the suicide prevention, there are a lot of organizations out there, but what do they do? I mean, if someone is thinking about, how can I help in some way? And sometimes, ideally, the best is their time, but for others, they don't have that. And so they want to be able to financially help and donate. What does what does the suicide prevention groups do? What do they do that really has value, and how do they do it as far as your understanding
Yeah,
and experience?
sure. Well, with my first brother-in-law, that was the real shocker. Okay, he had lived a little further, about 80 miles from us, so we didn't see him often. But when he took his life, we found, we heard the news on Thanksgiving evening, and so that was our first exposure to suicide. Now, when her second brother started showing signs, we were so proactive on trying to help him. We took him to one group after another with his wife as well. And the idea with the prevention groups is to first of all assess, what's going through that person's mind. What is this really a shout out that they may or they're considering taking their own life, or is it just a cry out that they need someone? I'm not able to make that assessment, but professionals can make that assessment. So suicide prevention is not so much to give for someone to call who's already on the ledge, but for them to get involved early in the process to assess just exactly what's going on. Oftentimes we're afraid to say anything because we always say, well, this is probably nothing, and we don't say anything. And so we don't get those professionals involved early on. So I would say that, in most of the suicide prevention groups that I've come across, first thing they do is assess the situation. And it's not easy, but I would say if one of your loved ones, one of, friend, and a lot of times they don't talk, especially younger people, they don't want to talk to family. But if it's a peer, have somehow get them in front of somebody that could really assess where they are in their life. Even if it's a therapist who.
Yeah. So here's the question, and you mentioned that with your wife there was no indication, and I think for others there are some indications. With your experience going through this, and I'm sure with speaking with others, do you find that there are some indicators that if we're aware of those and observe those, we're able to get hope or get help for our loved one earlier than later? And if so, what are those few key indicators?
Right. And again, I'm not an expert at this by no
No.
means, but
Right.
from my experience, the first thing that I saw with my wife was an exaggerated sense of, my daughter was engaged, and we were talking about her wedding, and all of a sudden, my wife over a few months was so worried about finances, even though I had the money for my daughter's wedding put aside. And she kept bringing it up, are we going to be able to afford this? We're going to be able to afford this. It doesn't sound like much, but when I look back, those were the initial signs of just abnormal behavior with a particular item. She became very nervous about germs. I thank God, you talk about gratitude. I thank God she didn't experience COVID because she was so nervous about any type of germ but even to an amazing degree. Like when I would have to come home from the hospital, my ministry, and I'd have to get completely dressed, unchanged outside, and leave my clothes in the car because God forbid if I um, brought a disease in from the hospital. So there was an extreme amount of behavior that way, and then it moved into not being able to sleep. And we all have nights of sleeplessness, but after you have two or three or four, it starts to manifest itself into different things. So again, everyone's a little different, but there were some signs that I would look for and get them in front of someone. Now we took my wife to a therapist. We took her to a psychologist. We took her to a psychiatrist. They did not see this coming the way it fell out either.
Yeah.
So it's no guarantee that a professional will. I look back and I think, well, I should have did this, I should have did that, but I believe I did all I could. But there's just some things. But the suicide hotlines and websites can give you your readers, your audience much more detail.
Great. And so how do people access your book, The Deacon and Unexpected Life?
Yeah. Well, if you did a search on the book, it's pretty much everywhere, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. But I would suggest just going to my website, which is my name, thomasfargnoli.com, right? Just Thomas, no spaces, Fargnoli, Fargnoli. I've got that lasagna thing going, fargnoli.com. And on the website is pretty much all information about me, about the book, even a little bit of magic. And they can order it right from the website. Again, proceeds go to suicide awareness. And I think there's a lot of groups that, not just prevention groups, but awareness groups that can talk about a lot of the things that you brought up in this interview.
Well, Tom, thank you for sharing. It's something that not many people are willing to do, and I'm sure you are making a huge impact on some lives. And hopefully, as you say, you've gotten some letters that let you know that, and in other cases, you'll never know, other than the fact that you can have faith and understanding that touching those lives makes a big difference. So I really appreciate you being on your show. I really appreciate you being willing to share that story, which I know is so sensitive to you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Doug. It's been my pleasure.
You bet. And folks, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to having you join us again soon.